with the passages of Scripture I give her. I give her some tough passages of Scripture, and I say, put some music together for her. And she reads this passage of Scripture, and she says, I don't like this passage of Scripture. Well, there's a lot of people who don't like that passage of Scripture, so feel comfortable with that. But as we delve into it and get to know it and understand it, we begin to get a bigger picture of what this passage is about. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. Hosea's ministry was approximately 30 years. It began near the final days of King Jeroboam II. And Jeroboam had reigned over a time of political stability and economic prosperity. But when he died, there began a prolonged national crisis. And Hosea was there in the midst of it all. The Assyrians had expanded their mighty empire and had demanded that Israel in the north pay them tribute, or what we might call taxes, or what we might call protection money. This really never went over well with the people of Israel, and they lurched between appeasing their enemy by paying this heavy tribute and outright rebellion against them by trying to seek alliances with Syria and Egypt. Of the 6 kings who reigned in Israel over the next 20 years, 4 of them were assassinated. It may have been the best of times, but it was looking more and more like the worst of times. It was Hosea's calling to warn them about putting their hope in alliances with other countries rather than the living God. It was Hosea's calling to warn the people of Israel, not to chase after every popular pagan god that came down the pike. They were to worship and put their trust in Yahweh only. It was not an easy task for Hosea. To preach to a people filled with fear, who were grasping at every straw imaginable, hoping against hope that they could wheel and deal themselves into a power position with political alliances. And since Yahweh did not appear to be helping them, it isn't surprising that they grasped at every false god around them in hopes that they could magically ward off evil and destruction that was about to fall upon them. Hosea had lived during the same time as that hard-nosed, fiery, hellfire and damnation preacher Amos. Boy, he could burn you up. I can imagine that Hosea went to hear him speak. And speak he did. Amos condemned everything that was condemnable. He got on the people about their oppression of the poor and their empty religion. He let them know that without question, that God was going to bring down judgment upon their heads. And I suspect that Hosea was deeply influenced by Amos. Maybe he got it into his head, that's the kind of preacher I'm going to be. And I believe he started out that way. But even us preachers get surprised by God. Whether God told him to do it, or whether the scripture shows this as Hosea's hindsight, Hosea went and married a very questionable woman. She may have been a religious prostitute serving in one of the pagan temples, or she may have been simply a common whore, selling herself to the highest bidder. We don't know. But what we do know is it doesn't take a professional marriage counselor to know that this situation spells trouble. And trouble it was. Hosea's wife, Homer, had 3 children, and probably none of them looked like Hosea. Despite the pain of his marriage, he had a job to do. These prophets were tough. Hosea had to confront this people of Israel about their situation in relation to the Lord. So what he did was that he turned his kids into living billboards, flesh and bone messages to the people. Every time one of the sons or daughters' names were spoken, the people's sins and the sureness of God's judgment was heard in their ears. The first son Gomer had was given the name Jezreel. Now, this was a term in Hebrew associated with some of Israel's bloodiest chapters in its history. Hosea had been staunchly opposed to the king of Israel's military policies of expansion during its supposed golden years. To make his point, he named his son Jezreel. This probably offended everyone who heard his name. It would be like, what a cute baby. What's his name? Auschwitz? Or, pay attention to the roll call in class, children. Joan, Longworth, Meli. Has Meli come in from recess? I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name on this resume, Mr. Fallujah. The name Jezreel was a sickening reminder to them of their failures, their violence, their pride, their illusions of greatness. But Hosea wasn't finished. The second child, a daughter with acid bitterness, was named Not Pitied. Now, it's impossible for us to recapture the terror this name provoked to its hearers' ears. Throughout ancient scripture, in the Torah, in the Old Testament, over and over, the pity of the Lord was the foundation of the covenant, the original contract between the people and God. God had promised to always have pity on God's people, always. In saying literally, I will no longer have pity on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. God is saying the covenant is at its end, it's over. And just so they didn't miss the point, when the third child, the son, was born, Hosea named him Lo-Ami, which translates, you are not my people, and I am not your God. This summarizes and utterly reverses what the Lord had promised in the covenant with Moses way back in the wilderness during their time of wandering. Do you remember the key promise of the covenant? You will be my people, and I will be your God. Hosea's child is named Lo-Ami. You are not my people, and I am not your God. Now you may be thinking, how cruel to use your children for your own ends. And I understand that. And these Old Testament prophets, they didn't play. But before we cast too much judgment on them, remember that while we're saying, thank God we don't use our children for our own ends, we don't pressure our kids to go to certain colleges or have a certain kind of occupation, or tell our children that a military career is not going to conflict with what we teach in the Bible, or encourage girls to grow up too fast or to be popular at any cost, or boys to join sports which have high rates of concussions. No, we don't use our children for our own ends. But as I mentioned earlier, God is full of surprises. And God has not finished with Hosea. In the midst of his attempt to be a faithful prophet, Hosea's marriage completely falls apart. Gomer abandons him, as well as her 3 children. I'm sure it was a terribly painful thing for Hosea. Imagine hearing the rumors that kept getting back to Hosea. Oh, she's gone back to her old ways. The all too accurate reports about each and every man she was sleeping with. I can imagine the sympathy and the pity for Hosea from the local community. Did you hear how she left him with 3 kids? I can imagine a number of single women and widows who might have dropped by to offer a shoulder to cry on or a nice pot of chicken soup. But that didn't last. When people found out that Hosea was still trying foolishly, as they thought, to get her back, I imagine the sympathy began to dry up. Well, you know there's no fool like an old fool. I hear she has hit the gutter. I imagine the neighbors began to hold Hosea in contempt, especially when that day came when Hosea went down to the slave auction and bid on Gomer to get her back, or what was left of her. Imagine how the neighbors watched as Hosea headed back home with Gomer, her head down, trailing behind him. Imagine how the neighbors talked. Imagine how they called him a fool. But something had happened. Something had happened to that old fool. Somewhere along the way, Hosea was caught by the surprise of God. He began to see in the midst of his own pain, the pain of God. He began to see in Gomer's face, the face of Israel. Just as Gomer had thrown her life away and rejected the covenant between her and Hosea, so Israel had rejected her lover, the God of covenant, the God of Israel. But the Spirit of God had melted Hosea's heart. He was no longer a prophet who preached judgment without hope. He had been given a small glimpse of the radical love of the Creator. And now he can announce to the people, God says, I will have no pity. But wait a minute. A new message from the Lord. I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or sword or war. I won't save them by missiles or tanks or military incursions, nor by bombs or drones or infantry. I will make it clear that it is the Lord their God who will save them, not their own might, their own economy, their own cunning. And then Hosea says, you know what I said about you no longer are my people and I am no longer your God? Wait a minute. Yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, innumerable, unending, and someday in the place where they heard, you're not my people, they will be called children of the living God. Hosea is proclaiming the end of the old covenant and the beginning of something new. He gets so carried away as he renames his children and renames the covenant for us. That someday Jezreel will be a place of great things, and the daughter whose name was No Pity is now called God Will Have Pity. And the son who was called You Are Not My People will now be called a child of the living God. Yeah. Hosea still preached the judgment of God to the people of Israel, but now it was different. In his own life experience, God had spoken to him and shown him that God does not cease to offer hope, even in the midst of judgment. Though Hosea does not understand what is yet to come, he has gotten the first glimpse of the God of suffering love. It is the long-awaited Messiah who comes to us in a manger and saves us through the suffering love revealed on the cross. That reveals the unending mercy of God to us. And in him we discover that we are called to become children of the living God. And as those children, showing that same mercy to others. Do you know how merciful God is towards your sin? And the question we all need to begin with is, have we accepted God's grace and forgiveness? And not let our failures snatch that away and fear that somehow God will cease loving us, cease offering us pity and forgiveness. For God is trying to make us children of God. Are you and I becoming children of God, showing the same love and mercy that God has shown us? The world longs for that, aches for that. God does not operate through mass media, but through human flesh. And as God came in Jesus Christ, God sends you, if you are a follower of Jesus, to show the world through your flesh the mercy and love of God. You are called to be a part of the continuing incarnation. What a wonderful, wonderful task. And God will be with you.